Imagine a continent where almost every country at some point decided, why produce when you can just take Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Chile, Bolivia. Decades, dozens of experiments, the same result every time. Poverty, mass exodus, blood. And in the last 2 or 3 years, almost the entire continent has turned around and started moving in the opposite direction. Today I'll show you how this happened, country by country, leader by leader. And by the end of the video, you'll understand that the hydra of socialism can be defeated. And it seems like it's even happening right before our eyes. 20th century Latin America is a laboratory of one idea. Wealth doesn't need to be created, it needs to be taken and divided. After the Cuban Revolution, which was in 1959, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara showed the continent that you could come to power under the slogan of justice and stay in power for decades. How did they do it? By taking away other people's property. That's a proven fact. The nationalization of land, factories, and banks in Cuba happened in the very first years after the revolution. They took it, but soon found out that for some reason collective farms produced much less than privately owned farms. So when it came time to divide what had been produced, it turned out to be less than when the owner paid everyone. They decided these were enemies of the people and shot a lot of people, and the next year they found out that there was even less left to divide. Because the comrades who were dividing things, well, those who were dividing, wanted to take a bigger share for themselves. They gave less to others and more to themselves. Well, that's kind of a socialist slogan. Which is, of course, surprising because everyone naturally used to think that those who would be dividing things would divide everything equally, or even take less for themselves. That is, there was little left to divide. And on top of that, most of it was taken by those who appointed themselves as the ones doing the dividing. Nobody liked that except for those who were dividing. Those who were dividing, they liked it. They liked it a lot. So they started to suppress any possibility of changing the order. They stood in formation and sang revolutionary songs, because if you stepped out of line or didn't sing, you would be shot immediately. Others followed Cuba's example. In Chile in 1970, yes, a socialist, Salvador Allende, came to power through democratic means, by the way, democratic means. And he began the nationalization of the copper industry and major enterprises. By the way, let me remind you that Adolf Hitler also came to power through an absolutely parliamentary and democratic process. In Nicaragua in 1979, the Sandinistas followed the Cuban model. In Venezuela in 1999, Hugo Chavez started the so-called socialism of the 21st century, as he called it, socialism of the 21st century. And this is probably the latest, the most destructive of all the experiments, at least here. On other continents, they experimented even more drastically. The logic was the same everywhere. I want you to remember it, because this is the key to everything we're talking about. There are only 2 ways to acquire property. The first is to produce it, and the second is to seize what has already been produced by someone else. To take it away, and then pretend that you're dividing it fairly. Any socialist, Marxist, or essentially fascist system. Because nationalization without abolishing private property is, legally speaking, fascism. Any such program chooses the second path, and the second path creates nothing. It only consumes what was created before. And here comes the most unexpected moment of this video. Some crowds, a rich person has a lot. So if you take it away, everyone will have more. But exactly the opposite happens. When taking becomes more profitable than producing, people stop producing altogether. The farmer doesn't lose his harvest, but he knows the government will come and confiscate it anyway, so why bother doing it, right? A factory won't modernize anything if they know it will be nationalized. In the end, it is not wealth that disappears, the wealthy disappear. Goods disappear from everyone's shelves. The paradox of socialism is that it promises abundance through redistribution, but it brings hunger through the destruction of production. This is the truth that it took people in Latin America almost 70 years to experience firsthand. And here is the question that should be asked right now. Why did people in these countries almost never have to be forced into socialism? They themselves voluntarily and enthusiastically followed this idea. Continuation. Because the idea is incredibly simple and incredibly emotionally appealing. And it's never thought through to the end. People, for the most part, are emotional beings, not rational ones. They don't think 3 steps ahead about the consequences. They're shown a simple picture. Here are the rich. They have a lot. We'll take it from them and give it to you, and everyone will be happy and things will be fair. Well, that's just amazing, right? In other words, you can get a fish out of the pond without any effort at all. It's easy to sell an idea like that. Any nation. But the emotional ones, like Latin Americans, they're also very emotional, so they just grabbed it with both hands, as they say. And by the way, they mostly work with their hands. And that's why their minds don't have time to develop well, especially in terms of critical, long, multi-step thinking. But what about those who went to universities, to the places where, theoretically, they should be taught to think independently, but it turned out exactly the opposite? In the university and so-called intellectual environment, people are persistently taught, you must not think independently under any circumstances. You have to listen to what the management, the leaders, the bosses say. When you're a student, it's the professors. What the party says. If you have doubts or say something you're not supposed to say, they either exile you, put you in prison, or simply don't let you advance in your career. So keep your mouth shut, and then you'll convince yourself that everything is fine. But the scariest punishment for these people, by the way, isn't even prison. The worst thing is when it's your own group, people you live with, work with, and socialize with. They start pushing you out of their community like an enemy. It's the fear of being excluded or pushed out. The fear of exclusion from your circle outweighs the fear of prison. And that's why people are willing to do absolutely anything just so they won't, God forbid, be pushed out of their social circle, just like that, without a single shot fired. Inside these countries, socialism swept across the continent like a wildfire through dry grass, meeting almost no resistance. Before we go any further, country by country with the figures and the names, subscribe. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the continuation of this topic, because what comes next will be about something you definitely don't expect to hear. If you're interested in a deeper, systematic analysis of why freedom works and redistribution doesn't, check out the link in the description to the channel Roadmap to Freedom. There I break down these mechanisms, but I go into much more detail there, right? In summary, first laboratory, Cuba. Cuba, and definitely not the Yankees. Let's start with Cuba, because this is the longest experiment. For more than 65 years, it's been the same model. Before the revolution, Cuba was one of the most developed countries in Latin America in terms of per capita income. This is a confirmed fact based on UN statistics from that period. So, after the nationalization of sugar mills, oil refining, and trade, the island became dependent on Soviet subsidies. In fact, Cuba did not produce enough to feed itself. It survived on subsidies from Moscow. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the subsidies disappeared. And Cuba fell into the special period. That's what they called it. The Cubans themselves called it that. Hunger, power outages, bicycles instead of cars. This is not an opinion. These are documented facts, described by dozens of independent journalists and historians. And what's especially telling is that after more than 60 years of building socialism, Cuba still uses a ration card system for distributing food. Ration cards for bread, ration cards for butter, ration cards for rice. And this is in the 21st century, while in the US, 2% of the population feeds the entire country. And on top of that, they dream of selling just as much electricity and oil refining to someone else. Today, according to independent observers and Cuban émigré organizations, and I'm stating this as one version, because you shouldn't trust the official Cuban statistics. In the past few years, more people have left the country in proportion to the population than ever before in its history, including the raft exodus in the 1990s. In the 1990s, half the country tried escaping on rafts. And so in Cuba, the socialist experiment has completely failed. The 8 richest countries in the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries on the planet. In terms of per capita income, it was among the 8 richest countries, ahead of many Western European nations. This is a confirmed historical fact. Vast, fertile lands, export of grain and beef to Europe, an influx of capital and immigrants who came to Buenos Aires in search of a better life. Back then, it was the same as, let's say, coming to New York at the beginning of the 20th century, right? But when wealth accumulated in the country, people developed the desire not to create something new, but to take away what others had created. In 1946, Juan Perón came to power. The real, as they called him, the great divider of the continent. Yes, the great divider. Peronism is the nationalization of entire industries. Government control over wages, prices, generous social programs. As for financing, so to speak, it's not about the growth of production, but about consuming the wealth the country has already accumulated. Next to him was his wife, Eva Perón, the very same Evita who later became the subject of musicals, films, and plays all over the world, turning her into a romantic icon. But if you take away the music and the glitter, what we have is a woman who used her own charity foundation as a personal tool for political power and patronage, handing out money and favors in exchange for loyalty. It's a classic model of a broker in its purest form. By the number of ruined lives, lost generations, and economic losses that Peronism brought to Argentina for decades to come. According to many historians, she is responsible for almost as much as some of the truly bloodthirsty dictators of the 20th century. Only she didn't kill with bullets, but by slowly destroying the country's ability to produce. By the way, the United States of America has its own Evita. Her name, however, is not Evita, but Hillary Clinton. She did exactly the same things, but for some unknown reason, 80 people who had dealings with this family were around her, either died under mysterious circumstances or committed suicide. Moreover, several suicides were committed with a gunshot to the back of the head. There was even one case where a person shot themselves in the back of the head twice. I'm not joking. The result is well known. Argentina, which could have rivaled the US and Canada in terms of wealth, spent the next 8 decades in a cycle of constant inflation. Defaults, crises. Peronism outlasted Juan Perón by half a century, and it was only in 2023 that Argentina really started to get out of this trap. But more on that later. Now let's talk about Nicaragua. The revolution against the dictator turned into a new dictatorship. That's what I've been saying all along. In Nicaragua, socialism didn't come out of nowhere. It was brought by a revolution against a real dictator, and these ones weren't real. You see, the Somoza family ruled the country with an iron fist since the 1930s. It was deeply corrupt. That's why when the left-radical Sandinista National Liberation Movement overthrew the dictatorship in 1979, a significant part of the country and even part of the international community was genuinely glad. It was an uprising against real tyranny, and that's a confirmed historical fact. How many times have I told you already that none of the revolutions or changes brought about by force, whether by the country's own people or by foreigners, ever lead to an improvement in the situation? For the people, it was either the same after the revolution or even worse. All that happened was that a different group of people started robbing their citizens. One group was robbing, then there was a revolution, and another group started robbing. Then the same scenario played out as in Cuba. After coming to power, the Sandinistas began nationalizing land and industry, essentially built a one-party system, and closely aligned themselves with Cuba and the Soviet Union. The logic was exactly the same. They defeated the injustice of one dictator and almost immediately began building a new kind of injustice. Well, just under different slogans, but the injustice was of a new kind, admit it. The United States responded by funding the armed opposition, the Contras, and plunged the country into a 10-year civil war, during which the economy simply collapsed. In 1990, I think, the Sandinistas unexpectedly lost the free elections and left power for a while, but the story didn't end there. In 2007, one of the leaders of the revolution, Daniel Ortega, was elected again. And over the next almost 2 decades, he turned the country into one of the most closed-off authoritarian regimes in Latin America. With the suppression of any opposition, the press and the church, the revolution that began as an uprising against a dictator came full circle and became a complete dictatorship. Well, that's actually how it usually happens. Well, of course, you've been waiting for me to tell you about Venezuela. How do you become poor when you have the largest oil reserves in the world? That takes some doing, right? And so, Venezuela is a country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world. That's a fact. This is confirmed by OPEC data. Hugo Chavez came to power promising to share the oil wealth with everyone. And it sounded wonderful. Our national wealth is distributed among a few, some of whom are actually from abroad. We will take back our national wealth from them and share it among everyone, and everyone will be rich. We will take from everyone we can, and we will no longer have poor people. We will no longer have injustice. We will no longer have the exploitation of man by man, but the opposite. You can work or not work. Either way, you'll have something to live on. Well, that's just music to the ears of the people in that country, right? Chavez nationalized the oil company, confiscated all agricultural land, introduced price controls. Within a couple of decades, the country with the largest oil reserves on the planet ended up without gasoline at its own gas stations. This is not a paradox. This is a direct consequence of what I mentioned above. When oil producers are deprived of incentive and competent management, oil simply stops being pumped from the ground. It just stops, that's all. We don't know why. It just stops. So the result is hyperinflation, which economists estimated at millions of percent per year. And a mass exodus, according to various estimates, well, more than 7 million people. The largest migration wave in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. Chavez's followers held on to power with brutality, fraud, and repression against the opposition. This has been repeatedly confirmed by independent observers. And here's the outcome, which I'll talk about a bit later in this video, because it's actually part of the new things happening on the continent right now. This is practically a classic case where, as they say, it practically gushes out of the ground. You don't really have to do anything, just count the money. But even under socialism, it's impossible to do this. Even this can't be done under socialism. It turned out that socialists aren't even capable of feeding their own population. I think everyone has seen footage of university professors searching through trash bins, looking for something to eat. Venezuela has become a symbol of true socialism. Socialism with a human face. Dogs didn't suffer from it, only humans, people suffered. And now as promised. If you were born in the USSR or in post-Soviet countries, you've already seen ration cards for food, right? Slogans about justice, a party that knows better how to divide what others have produced. The only difference, I don't know, is the climate, the geography. Palm trees instead of snow. In a few minutes, I'll show you that the very generation of Latin Americans who grew up with these slogans is now doing what our parents and grandparents couldn't do during Soviet times. They are rejecting this model en masse at the polls. And this gives us people from the former USSR living in America and around the world a clear lesson. The Hydra can be defeated, not with a bayonet, but by voting. Well, of course, if people manage to see the consequences before an entire generation dies. The truth is, the Hydra first tries to deceive, and then shoots everyone who stands in its way of ruling. Something happened in America that actually served as the foundation for a shift in global consciousness. Global consciousness. It's called the Trump Revolution. It awakened those in Latin America who know how to think. This isn't just a slogan, the facts from the past 2 or 3 years prove it. I'll review them one by one. Let's return to Argentina, which we mentioned earlier in the video, that very country which the great divider Perón led out of the ranks of the world's 8 richest countries for a long time. Since the 1930s, the country has not been able to break free from the Peronist state model. Constant cycles of inflation and crisis. In 2023, Argentinians elected President Javier Milei, a libertarian economist who came with an openly anti-state platform. In a relatively short period, Milei tamed hyperinflation, achieved a budget surplus, stabilized the currency, and attracted foreign investment. Last year, his party unexpectedly won big in the midterm elections to Congress. So, Argentinians not only endured his reforms, they supported them in subsequent elections. That's important. People vote for production, not for taking from others. For the second time in a row. That's incredible. It means things really hurt over there. Next is Bolivia. So, Evo Morales came to power in 2006 and immediately started what keeps repeating in Latin America with alarming regularity. He nationalized the gas and oil industries, expanded government control over almost all key sectors of the economy, and generously spent the profits from the commodity boom on social programs that built loyalty. Yes, but they didn't create any new production capacity. While gas and metal prices were high, the model held up more or less. But when prices fell, the same old problem was exposed. A state that only knows how to redistribute is a thieving state. It starts to suffocate without a constant inflow of other people's money. Morales ruled for almost 20 years. Well, using increasingly authoritarian methods, the same thing, more and more, tightening the screws even further each time. Clinging to power, including, well, controversial attempts to bypass constitutional term limits, which eventually led to mass protests and his resignation in 2019, I think, amid accusations of election fraud. Morales' party is the Movement for Socialism. Movement for Socialism. Yes, a fascist party called the Movement for Socialism. It continued to rule the country after his resignation, but in 2025, that era finally came to an end. The ruling Socialist Party did not get a single seat in the Senate. Not a single seat in the Senate at all. And a centrist reformer named Rodrigo Paz came to power. Almost 20 years of socialism and 0 seats in parliament. That's a record, I think. One of the clearest indicators of what's happening to the entire continent. Chile perhaps took the most dramatic path. In 1970, a socialist, Salvador Allende, was democratically elected president. Everyone knows this name. And he repeated a scenario familiar to us. Nationalization, in this case of the copper industry, the main source of the country's income, agrarian reform with land confiscation, price controls. In 1973, the economy was in a deep crisis, hyperinflation, shortages of goods, political paralysis, and actual civil confrontation in the streets. In September 1973, there was a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet. This is a confirmed historical fact, as is the fact that the regime established after the coup was authoritarian and harshly suppressed political opponents. This is also documented and beyond doubt. But in the economy, Pinochet did something that is key to this entire video. He invited a group of economists who were educated at the Chicago School. They were called the Chicago Boys. This is the free market. And he gave them the opportunity to carry out reforms, privatization of state enterprises, opening the economy for trade, deregulation, and protection of private property. The economy, freed from total government control, began to grow. It was these reforms that laid the foundation for what many economists call the Chilean economic miracle. Decades of steady growth, which by the 1990s and 2000s made Chile one of the most stable and prosperous economies on the continent. Here it is, the common thread that runs through this entire video. The state takes from the producer and hunger follows. When the state allows production, growth follows. Even if the political regime under which this happened was far from ideal. In Chile, a country that for decades after Pinochet balanced between the left and the right, In December 2025, the right-wing candidate Jose Antonio Cast won a decisive victory in the second round against the candidate from the Communist Party. The Communist Party. Official data shows he got over 58% of the votes. In Honduras in 2025, the right-wing candidate Nasri Asfura won the election, while the candidate from the ruling Socialist Libre Party received less than 20% of the votes, a direct defeat for the same ideological camp that ruled in Venezuela and Cuba. In Ecuador, the incumbent president Daniel Noboa, a supporter of the free market, was re-elected with a margin of more than 10%. This is the largest margin in a presidential election in Ecuador, I think, in the last, 20 or 30 years in Costa Rica. In February 2026, the right-wing conservative candidate Laura Fernandez won the election in the first round, receiving more than 48% of the votes. This continues the policy of strengthening budget discipline. And finally, Venezuela. The very country I mentioned a few minutes ago. According to information that was widely discussed at the beginning of this year, the Nicolas Maduro regime ceased to exist in January 2026 amid military actions and the detention of Maduro himself. I have to state that this is a claim that requires further independent confirmation. But the very fact that Venezuela's long-ruling Chavista regime ended at the beginning of 2026 is already treated by the source as an established reality. Just a few days ago, on June 21, 2026 in Colombia, the first right-wing candidate, Abelardo da Esparillo. I really hope that Esperilla, probably, yes, something. That's how it is. He won the second round of the presidential election against the candidate of the current left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, with the smallest margin of votes in the country's history. This is a very recent report. But the information is still being updated, though the direction remains the same. Look at the whole list. Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, right? Ecuador, Costa Rica, Venezuela. 8 countries in 2 or 3 years have turned in the same direction. According to the sociological company Latino Barometro, the share of Latin Americans who consider themselves right-wing or center-right has reached the highest level in 2 decades of observation. Political scientists in Latin America itself are already calling this a conservative shift of historic proportions, comparable in significance to the so-called wave of democratization of the 1980s. Socialization, fascistization, communization, some kind of democratization, damn it all. That's what they call a wave of democratization, the seizure of power by leftist thugs. If you've watched this far, gentlemen, please give it a like. It really helps the channel get through the algorithms, and write in the comments which Latin American country you have friends or relatives in. I'm curious what they tell you there about the changes from the inside. Over these decades of socialist experiments, it's not just about inflation rates, but about human lives and generations thrown out of normal life. More than 7 million Venezuelans is not just a number in a report. These are families torn apart, children who grew up without fathers who left to earn a living. To Colombia, Peru, Chile, the United States. According to organizations working with refugees, the Cuban emigration of recent years is the largest wave since the beginning of the revolution. Nicaragua has lost a significant part of its own middle class and intelligentsia due to the repressive regime. And here's what's especially important, and this is rarely mentioned. The greatest harm was caused not by poverty itself, but by the lost decades. A generation who could have built businesses, invented, or taught, instead spent their lives waiting for ration cards or emigrating to start over. That's the kind of price that can never be recovered. But no reforms can ever bring back the time that was lost. Here, it's worth recalling a simple principle that I mention in every one of my videos. Only a person who is allowed to produce can actually produce. What he wants is to buy materials wherever he wants, hire whoever he wants, pay the market what the market demands, compete with others, and keep as much of what he earns as possible. What he earns. Of what he earns, giving the state only what is necessary to protect the person and the country. This is the difference between Cuba in 1926 and Argentina in 1926. Neither natural resources nor climate nor history, but rather the question of whether the producer is allowed to produce. The idea of making America great again turned out to be contagious, but not in the sense of nationalism, but in the sense of a basic principle. Work is more important than slogans. Production is more important than distribution. This idea is now literally cleansing the continent of fascists, communists, and socialists, not with bayonets, but thank God with the minds of voters. A question arises. Are homegrown Trumps emerging in Argentina, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Chile? Each has their own style, their own personality, but a common direction. Respect for labor, respect for capital, respect for those who actually move the economy forward, not for those who just talk beautifully about justice and build illusions. These are different specialties, producing and talking. We hope that all of Latin America will gradually move toward a normal life where labor is respected, capital is respected, and people who drive production forward are respected. But the main thing is what should happen and is happening now, and that is that the intellectual elite of these countries, professors, journalists, writers, who for decades romanticized the word socialism, finally are beginning to understand how much harm they have caused by leading entire nations down this path with beautiful slogans. They reveled in it, they played with it, while people, hundreds of thousands, millions, ended up with ruined lives. Marxism. One after another, country after country is consigning Marxism to the ash heap of history, thank God. History gives us a rare chance to see how theory loses to practice right before our eyes. Right before the eyes of our generations. 3 generations are witnessing this. God willing, they will remember it. If you found this video helpful, subscribe to my Telegram channel. Leon Veinstein, Veinstein US, the link is in the description. There I cover these topics faster and more briefly almost every day. And of course, don't forget about the channel Roadmap to Freedom. That's where I post a deeper analysis twice a week, right? And that's where we build an understanding together of how freedom works and why production always wins. Whatever they do, production always wins. Until next time.